Wonderful. I am going to introduce my comrade and co-conspirator, Shereen Essof, who is coming to lead us and moderate and host the next panel on where do we go from here, constituency-based organizing across Africa, some reflections during a time of crisis, opportunities, contestations, and action. Please say more about why you are my co-conspirator.
Thanks, Toby. So I will ignore Tommy. My name is Shereen, and I am at heart an organizer. I'm from Zimbabwe, and I'm really, really excited to be able to lead the session today. I would like to invite, it's a hybrid session. So we have two people who are joining us online, and I would like to invite Luam and Bhekinkosi to come and join me up on stage as we prepare to pick the source. And I think our tech people are going to patch in the Nicolette and Halima, who are dialing in, I think, from South Africa. So if our technical could, there we go. Let's check. Hi, Halima. I hope you can hear me.
Shereen,
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I think Breaks put onto the table a number of important questions that really about the meaning of the collapse of a world order, the meanings of what that then means in terms of our vision for a truly liberated world. How do we come back to that unfinished business of liberation that has created divide, be they based on class, be they based on gender, be they based on sexual orientation, and what really happens when the structural underpinnings of our world start grinding against each other and, you know, a racist capitalism, white supremacy,
political needs, consolidation of, wealthy billionaires with interests begin to start unpicking the foundations of democracy. And I think that those questions that you can identify flowed through in some way in the panels and the panel conversations that we went this morning. I think in this session, we wanted to take a step in the direction of asking the questionnaires. So what is the meaning of people-centered democracy? What are the strategies? What are the forms of leadership that we need? And what is the vehicle for that answer, right? That you're inquiring to be able to deliver that more just, more equitable, more free world. And in saying that, we also wanted to put onto the table NGOs and NGOization as a form of neocolonialism, right? There's structures in particular ways that demand certain things from us, that keeps us right in chains in some way. But I think we are also wanting to put onto the table something that's flowed through the conversations this morning, which is the question on the meaning of resourcing. Resource, not in terms of life or financial resourcing, but resourcing is a very small understanding of the word, because we know, as many people said, there are many different ways that we have to resource ourselves. Right? And I think COVID was used as an example twice, a few times this morning, when the state says, we're not interested, right? We turn to each other, we turn to the communities, we turn to our own resources in a range of different ways to sustain us, rooted in the creativeness, rooted in local knowledge, rooted in what we know and what we need. And so, I get with Thomas, Nicolette and Halima to introduce themselves before they share what I think is a good example of knowledge and knowledge production as a movement organization, right? Because sometimes we need to produce our own knowledge to be able to form our strategies and actions. And so, in fact, at Halima, I taught a piece of research entitled "Where Do We Go From Here?" And I think, given the conversations this morning, that's plenty question for us to put on the table. So where do we go from here? Constituency-based organizing in Africa, reflections during a time of crisis, opportunity, contestation, and action. Before I hand over to Nicolette and Halima, I want to just flag that some of you may have participated in the research or the research process. But I'm sure that not everybody, in fact, perhaps know this week, has read the research report. And so we really wanted to use the session as a way of sharing information live, inviting you to engage with that, and it being reflected by the experience that both Luam and Bhekinkosi bring. And they will introduce themselves too when the time is right. To aid to capitalize on thinking that I hope will feed spill over this open session that we have after this. To aim to be some the conversation. Yeah, happy ones. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Okay, I see nods. So, Halima and Nicolette, hello, welcome. Lovely to have you join us. And I'm going to hand straight over to you both. If you could introduce yourselves and then straight into your research process, the findings that you've been saying that you would want to share with us.
Thank you so much, Shereen, and good afternoon, everyone from Johannesburg. So sorry that we couldn't be with you today. My name is Nicolette, and I'm the CEO and founder of Global Philanthropy, a consulting base here in South Africa, working at the intersection of justice, feminism, and philanthropy. Halima, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hey everybody, Halima Mohamed. I'm also calling in from Johannesburg, and I echo because I said not to be with you Europeans, appreciate you and shooting them like. I work in Philanthropy as a researcher and consultant in the philanthropy field. And as we call positive and negative in a philanthropy organizer, I'll take the positive one if I can. Yeah, stop there. So we
Thank you, Halima. So, maybe just to say before we get into the slide that's on your screen right now, how this came about, this really follows the concept at the Northern from 2018, 2022, and related funder meetings, where Trust Africa commissioned us to take this work forward and really think about what this moment means. I think the point I want to make is that in the last year, this has been an evolving inquiry, because when we started our interviews with many people, this was pre the US elections, and things changed a lot. And in the last few months, we were telling Briggs, listen, every week the context is shifting and changing some more. So the studies evolved in terms of also the geopolitical context and the funding and the organizing context on the continent that's actively changing. So the study could go on forever, but we really think some of the insights that come out of this study is really something to be clearly throughout the day as we talk about this presentation. While we were engaged by Trust Africa in the conceptualization of this work, the research process has been completely independent of Trust Africa. And so all the findings here, what we're going to be deliberating are our own and our own insights, but drawing on work interviews that we've done with people that are in the room today. I'm going to turn to Halima now to talk us through the methodology that we followed.
So bear with us as we play touchdown. We may be listening to greater bridges to speak up. So essentially our study looked at what's happening in terms of constituency colonizing, its what's face rate, and what are the implications of constituency violence need to transform the reasons in inside of the show. What I really want to introduce something of them as an invitation. So, we had 2 to 3 interviews, the sample size is more in relation to you. And this is meant to provide what we will present you today is meant to provide a snapshot of reflections on this issue at this moment in time, to surface the insights of collective and predictive ground discussions. We really want to emphasize there's no tick box trajectory to this work, and the findings highlight this. What we want to do is from principles, from politics, from contestations, and ideological debates of how do we support and engage because we've faced in the past. So we don't have the answers. The answers that are getting into the have to come from all of us collectively. The other thing we want to do kind of is that language and terminology, let's just put government on success. And understand this is more expansive, fluid, and conditioned, both within and outside. In terms of organizing movements, about people, please just one of them more organized, constituency organized, to refer to people that connect and organize this. We recognize that those reform and action trends still different. We use this framing to be a focus in school below can lead to a net with animative work here. Next thing about it is the key states and places movements and after between the calculation in the something earlier about does it always have to be masculinized? And so we have to start to understand what kind of organizing is needed and what does that mean? With us, this is widely, but not the only component institutions you organize. We also use the lens of movements in support as an entry point to talk about what we're still in, right? In using the social movement, do we recognize that there are very many different interpretations and definitions? However, we chose not to go into that, and avoid the international phase. What we do want to emphasize is not inclusion or global issues connected by incredibly innocent. They actually join because those are the articulations in that sense we're talking about which to real focus and agents debate against the injustice species and align the danger of corruption and the importance of making the politics to properly politics and systematic very strongly. Last one, philanthropy, just news excites healing, that institutionalized philanthropy, the national private philanthropy, and organic forms of actually philanthropy have been on steps. Next.
Thanks, Halima. Turning now to the context, we're going to just touch a bit, and I think we've heard a lot about the context. The only thing I would point out about this slide, we're seeing that close to 70% of the population in Africa is currently operating in spaces not considered repressed. And this is the data considered the state of civil society for 2024. And what's interesting is the global trends are exactly the same. Globally, you see 72.4% of the global population now lives under repressive conditions in terms of whether it's very open civic space, open for organizing, where it's very closed and repressive. I'm quite shocked because over the last decade that Cerebus has been tracking this, we've seen that gradually this is becoming more and more repetitive. And yet also that society people also found that is an amazing entity that's coming from outside of the bigger, quite these impressive conditions. You are seeing organizing and constituency like front of city active. So power is happening, and we saw that today from what we saw in Kenya to Ghana to Zimbabwe to Senegal. We are seeing a radical energy that's coming from groups that are often led by young people. I know mostly in factories. So we are seeing these mass mobilizations that struggle was taking place. He said it all this morning. The world as we know it's older. The system is imploding. And the main point I want to emphasize here is the high level of uncertainty, even though it was context. And I think it's worth noting that overseas development aid, the development trajectory, the fact that the development and humanitarian trajectories are being estimated at the moment. We must note that that form of funding never prioritized social movements. And so that was never like, oh, well, social movements were getting to their money from development aid. But I do think it puts a huge strain on the entire development sector now, because there's a strain on resources across the continent because of what's happening in the health space, in the education space, in the HIV space on the continent. And I think the point I want to make is the brokenness of the system has always been there. And we have for decades been critiqued the brokenness of models of development and philanthropy. And now, as we begin to be under attack, the development system under attack, we should also be refrain from romanticizing the way development aid happens. You see a lot of romanticizing the USA in this moment and romanticizing that system. I think the brokenness of the system is an opportunity. Is what we are critiquing, and in that way, the brokenness one can possibly be imagining things. I think that the landscape, particularly for the US, in terms of private national philanthropy. There's a target on what is being called bulk philanthropy by the US government, and we see targeted executive orders coming out. We see the global trade war was taking place in the last few weeks. We've seen how that's playing out between China and the US. We see how geopolitical alliances are shifting on a daily basis. But what this means for US philanthropy is very uncertain, particularly what Donald Trump is saying for woke philanthropy, progressive philanthropy. That's one thing that I in fact, our climate of heightened scrutiny for funders who are wanting to work around political organizing. And also being restrained, and the restrictions on political organizing has always been there. You already call the language being non-partisan, the kind of language that comes out of contracts from US Foundation has always been there. It becomes short now, we have this climate of hybrid scrutiny at the time where the politics of the movement demands political response. It demands political strategies, and you do have these restrictions around what we can't go down this political path. I think what we need to is during our interviews, one of the people we interviewed, and we heard this morning from Fumi as well. The speaker, we are also there's a crisis in the left at the moment, and we're suffering the agenda of the old left liberation movement, and we're unable to articulate an agenda of today. Many people we interviewed said we need to be reimagining what this moment looks like and what the brokenness of the system looks like. I think we want to turn now to some of the trends and opportunities that we heard about in this vibrant ecosystem of organizing. So we looked at trends and opportunities for organizing and constituency-based organizing on the continent, and this is what we heard.
So everyone talked earlier today about who choices in here, and that's come out strongly. But what we need to always think of is that despite this inflation of people, especially in means are found ways and create space for political discussion through multiple and diverse avenues. And what's really important that's emerging strongly in our conversations is that civic organizing is changing. And when we can't respond to these changes the same ways we have before. whether it is support, allyship, solidarity, or other C's to think about what does this changing civic space demand of us, and what does that mean for how we, how the support space, how the funding space engages. There's an increasing like so kind of associated to the youth organizing in Kenya, just planning for funding, which will really define Kenya for the city. We've been hearing about this in other spaces, about youth organizing the different interchangeable strategies, digital, non-digital, training, what's needed. We only understand enough around what this new forms of organizing spaces look like. And we're making assumptions about them and marginalizing them in ways that are not connected. But it also just creates for differences in generational organization, organizing and communication style we engage. We have to understand each other. We also see that movements organizing are raising funds in different ways. From outside to platform, outside of philanthropy, and the leveraging of political and financial support in very limited ways. By seeing a small but wide range of support infrastructure, from funders to intermediaries to those that provide non-financial support. But also see very diverse ways of engagement, engagement and financing spaces. So distributed leadership models, real source, and so taking leadership depending on what's needed, like appropriate to the context, and the assumptions we make about how these spaces are engaging with future community journeys.
We also heard that movements want to tackle issues at local, national, and transnational level. And I think this is exciting. We've seen this in the program today. What does transnational solidarity look like with colleagues in the United States at this moment in time? We're also seeing that cross-movement and Pan-African connectivity is increasing, but it's limited due to language and sub-regional specificities. We also heard during the interviews that it's important that we not treat the continent as a country, and the fact that there are sub-regional specificities and the importance that we be organizing at that local level, sub-regional level, and Pan-African level, and be thinking across the spectrum without privileging one over the other. Like we heard from Hanifa today, much of the mobilizing is happening and information sharing is happening online. The digital and the non-digital is being used interchangeably in response to this context, and that's quite exciting. We're also hearing that movements are organizing at particular moments and not necessarily for the long term. They're organizing as issues emerge or to respond to an emergent context. And it's not that they're going to be around in the NGO kind of way for the end of time. What we also saw was that there's much more of a cohesion of spaces with different partners playing supportive roles, where we see the cohesion of organizing between movements and NGOs, where NGOs can be seen as allies, where there's an alignment on values and collective struggle. But this is also very contested, and we're going to talk about the contested spaces, and I think 𝗕tože referenced this earlier. So there's an opportunity here in terms of some cohesion happening between movements and NGOs as allies in collective struggle, but there's some contradictions and tensions. And then we're also seeing there's much more intersectional power analysis happening in some spaces, not all spaces, and here, particularly amongst the feminist and women's rights spaces, we're seeing this happen. We now want to turn to what we found around how most of the funding for movements is happening. And there's nothing new here, really, in terms of what you all know and what you've all been talking about. The scale of support there's a chronic underfunding of support for movements. So the scale is limited in terms of scope and depth and reach, and the narrowing of focus areas into silos.
is often affecting the political agendas of movements who want to respond to emergent contexts. So the focus on, well, we only focus on climate or we only focus on gender, that's often not the way movements and broad-based organizing is happening. So there's still a donor-driven agenda that's dominating. It's a donor-driven agenda, notwithstanding all the rhetoric around movements in the center. Donors are still framing the engagement around their own silos of working. And it's a small part of the work. It's often time-bound and project-specific. A lot of focus when a movement is in the news, when it's sexy, let's focus on this peak moment or the wins and not on long-term power building. And not focusing when things go wrong, because this work is messy and it does go wrong. And so that's another trend that's always been there, and where there has been a pushback and a critique about that. And we found that it
recording in the organization, shifting power, one of the pledges. Then, some of these have put about more focus on changes in practice, like slightly longer time frames, slightly flexible plans, and yes, those are necessary, but they're not. Where it really matters, philanthropy at large has not been able to fund movements in ways that are truly transformative. A solidarity that's premised on the truth that reckon that with the struggles. That is, that it's a what seeking to constrain it or direct it. Brings back the conversation on power. Institutions are particularly shying away from. The conversation is often about whether the revolution can be funded, but what we're hearing is that the revolution is being actively defunded. There's a political contestation, political at multiple levels, that needs to be engaged, and political strategies have to be part of the toolbox. So what does it then mean to have resourcing and support that enables the space for those political strategies to be used as needed?
Of funding. We've put two quotes here from two people that we interviewed during the course of which were themes that also came up from most of the people that we spoke to. The fact that one becomes highly compromised because you're dependent on international relationships and funding was the one view that came out. And what this means for dependency. We heard from one person, that we locked in a culture of dependency, and we've lost our sense of imagination around how to imagine what independence looks like. We overwhelmingly heard over and over again the need to center African resources in all its diversity, and African giving in all its diversity as a critical pillar to underlie the agency and independence of movements, that there's always going to be a level of compromise with international funding relationships. And what does it look like to free ourselves? Too often we're focusing on give us general, or give us longer term funding from 2 years to 5 years. But what would it look like to have truly independent sources of funding that allows one to take political positions and to engage in civil disobedience as and when you please, without being held accountable for saying down with the president in a speech that you make? And then the interesting, just go back one slide, the quote here around African giving. What we haven't factored in enough, and we need to understand much more significantly, is how giving is also part of constituency building, and how giving and individual giving by movements for their own causes is actually building collective identity and solidarity and reciprocity, rather than transactional grant relationships where one is writing an actual contract. And this myth that it isn't money. Oh, we can't get money. They're on the cleaner. I think we need to unpack that a bit, and I must then talk a bit more about that next.
Yeah, we've been talking to people we see and more convinced we are about how we have internalized, all of us collectively, so many of these myths. 𝗔𝗯ance is openly talked about internal awakening, about power and agency from our own discipline. So organic giving systems and civic activism as giving have long been a feature of our societies, but really counted as such. You talked earlier about one's body in the line for the greater good. And if that's not an act of giving, then what is, right? That is philanthropy. But it is about these conversations that individual community has been just significant. It's been seen as lacking in scale, as too insular, as too ameliorative. And the narrative of the importance of big money and this chasing those big grants has drowned the value of what does collective giving mean at scale. Countries also to better understand things like middle class giving, small business giving, giving by professionals, giving, digital giving, etc., as important factors to engage with. But I want to go back to the individual giving. We as Africans, we don't give to institutions. This is something we are often, and especially in global conversations, but even in our own conversations, and this is a myth. So there was an Africa report that I was involved in last year, which challenges some of these long-held assumptions about philanthropy in Africa, showing for the first time at a pan-African level, and there have been individual studies at country levels, but at a pan-African level, how individual giving is a primary funding resource. Percent of CSOs listed individual donations as amongst the top 3 funding sources. 42% of them reflected new funding from individuals, even during COVID. This was a higher percentage than what they were getting from externally. In terms of, those that are saying that this is important. Interestingly, the study also counters wild assumptions about external funding automatically crowding out individual constituents giving. We keep saying, oh, well, the minute the grants are going to come in, we're going to damage the existing dynamic. We're going to break down that sense of ownership. And I think that organizing space has also that one of the steps going us is that these institutions are holding diverse relationships with different types of giving simultaneously, and we just don't understand that enough. We saw that this giving operates at multiple levels through community, national, international, Pan-African, and so we have to think about the scope and scale of this. Two more things like here is that we saw that the organizations receiving this individual giving are organizations that are also involved in advocacy and involved in organizing and mobilizing. These are not through activities external and that's generally associated with individual giving. And so these are again my important considerations for us to rethink how we can looking at the issue of diaspora giving and remittances, both have been much interesting giving on this scale, right? In 2023, Remitscope noted 90.2 billion in remittances to Africa. And that's just, and we know there's significantly much more going through other channels. We also know from lived experience that remittances are often much more than just interfamily transfers and often have considerations beyond that family unit. So how do we think of just as remittances, but also having a philanthropic component? Lastly, we talked about internal resourcing of the movements and organizing spaces that are a lot as to plan and resources in all the variations of the word provided by activists themselves are powerful and has been ignored and marginalized. One of these and individual giving mattered for the exploration and could really play a pivotal role in bolstering the independence and agency of social movements. But we need to rethink how we understand these spaces and what the implications of this kinds of giving are. Nicolette?
We want to turn now to what we heard around some of the narrative challenges and tensions. There's an issue around narrative dissonance. And we've put a quote up there around this fantasy. There's an appetite for the social movements are part of and social movement really reflected on rather than just the surface conversations that are happening. So on the one hand, there is an expectation on social movements as the sites for radical transformation. And on the other, there's this expectation that you need to meet a set of changing rules that's unwritten that also seek to police and moderate your scope of actions, your tenor of words, the language you use. We heard in one of our interviews, language like, oh no, he's too vulgar, or that one's a problem, or no, as long as you say anything about Palestine. And so this policing of the way in which organizing happens is taking place up to the romanticized fantasy of social movements. Of these spaces that come from externally projected ideas about both the form and the function. And there's very little of the organizing spaces and the different forms and configurations that can take place that's not divorced from contemporary politics and slavery. There's a tension between advocacy and service delivery, seeing service delivery as part and parcel of the politics of organizing. And so the hierarchy that's been created around service delivery versus of this. There's been a lot of expectations around how social movements should be adopting structures and forms that have not organically evolved. There's a push to evolve in particular for purpose. It's a lot easier this way if you just do this. So, like some of the that we picked up, and what fun in terms of we really want to get behind movements, but it's also, well, as long as they conform to how we're thinking about things.
I don't think it's Nicolette talked earlier about intermediaries and where they were seeing some complementarities between NGOs, intermediaries, movements, organizing spaces. But we also want to recognize how this came up in many conversations as sites of contestation, right? And when we're talking about intermediaries, we're talking about, and people refer to this by different names as intermediaries. There are also African foundations. There are also re-granters. Some of these, most of these are African-led, but resourced from the outside. So there's a way in which organizations identify themselves in different ways, but the catch-term phrase of the intermediaries is being
Nicolette, I just want to say,
what's really shouted out at us is that it's a false choice to be asking whether there should be direct support for movements or indirect support through infrastructure. Support is needed for both. But what's difficult is that support comes through a small and limited pool that is even further retreated. And we have to think about this very carefully as we think about what is resource needed. These institutions reflect systems and structures of the nation and mark out stricter northern practices through not bound by the same legislative and normative frameworks. And there needs to be an unbundling of that. It's we can be differently in response to what the spaces are asking. The third is that power exists. It's an inherently unequal dynamic, but the sense that many African intermediaries are not engaged with the beyond the African continent is not enough. Power still resides within the world and how to think.
Nicolette and Halima, can you hear me?
That is it.
You have about 3 minutes.
Shereen.
And I think they can hear me now.
Oh.
Can you hear me, Nicolette and Halima? Yes, we can. You have about 3 minutes, and then we want to bring Bheki and Luam into the conversation. So this is just a time check for you. Thanks, Shereen. I think what I won't go through what we spoke of is the types of contests and in the civic space, and the need to identify NGOs that can play more of a shuttle role with trust as well. There's an absence of hard conversations around contestation, competition, complementarity. And I think while competition often at the heart of contestation between movements and NGOs, tactics, strategy are all part of the tensions in this space. So it's just about the tactics. I think if we can just go ahead to our last 2 slides, or the slide around insight, the next slide. Yes, that one. Thanks. So some of what's come out for us and that we're hoping will set us on a conversation is that any campaign for support for more and better resourcing has to be driven by and for movements. And that we have to use a broader frame of organizing when we think about what support needs to be directed to and in service of what. It mustn't just be a narrow space. We've been overwhelmingly told, do not start with the money. Do not start with setting up a fund. The conversation on support has to start with the why of the work, from a place of solidarity and the politics of the work. It needs to focus on what's the constituency building that's necessary for the work to happen. This isn't to say that resourcing isn't an important factor, but it's not the anchor. And I think that's what we heard from many of the presentations today. Halima, do you want to start on that basis? I think
Quickly, very strongly is the need for spaces to think, to plan, to strategize, not very comfortable conversations. And the emphasis is on communal spaces. There's no one space that is going to meet the needs of what we require. And these spaces need to happen at different levels. We talked about local, matched, and again, not in a hierarchical way. Not convince the spaces, who supports the spaces and who leads the spaces are not always the same people, and this needs to be engaged. So they're much more collective and inclusive, that they're talking to each other, that we need the creation of this out of resources to support actions coming from those. So that we meet the urgency of the movement, even as we reflect. There were other issues around the importance of funder spaces also being needed, and lastly around strengthened and independent infrastructure. Look at what exists rather than creating new infrastructure. Don't just default to a new fund, a new organization. Think about how do we support what exists individually and collectively, and be wary about creating new vanguards of who we replicate inside or outside of it.
Thank you both. On the issue of resourcing, I think we're asking people to just reimagine resourcing, and to reimagine resourcing from within the African continent, to start there. There is a role for external resourcing from outside of the continent, but that external resourcing should be used to expand, amplify, connect, bring visibility, but start from the internal is what we say. And that there needs to be some hard conversations and collective positioning with funders on the how of the funding, politics of the funding, the politics of the moment, and making decisions around when to say yes and no to money. And what are the compromises that's willing to be made? If the structures and the systems of international philanthropy are not going to shift and are becoming more restrictive, what are the hard choices that need to be made? And any new funding must be radically different in terms of how it engages and thinks about solidarity and agency. And nothing is sacrosanct. We need to start engaging with topics like reparations. And all the topics that we've tended not to engage with, we really do need to be engaging with. We'll stop there, and we're hoping that this can launch us into a conversation.
Thanks, Nicolette and Halima. I hope everybody's still with us and has been fed by the research and the sharing. I would like to invite Luam and Becky to join me on stage.
As we end the session, I think it's important for us to turn and welcome Luam and Becky, who, yes, they will introduce themselves when they speak. But Luam and Becky, given what you've heard from Nicolette and Halima and some of the findings of the research, given your wealth of experience, what are the things that you are grappling with regarding movement organizing, power building, the constituency-based organizing, to use the term that Nicolette and Halima have introduced, as well as its resourcing, given the current context that we are in? So we're feeding the conversation that we've begun. I'm going to start with you, Luam. If you could introduce yourself, and then over to
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll keep my intervention short so that we can end the session. My name is Luam Kidane. I'm Eritrean activist living here, and currently am the director for Gender, Race, and Power at Open Society Foundations. Is that better? Great. And I've been working in climate economics and food sovereignty as a researcher and strategist for the last 15 years. So just a couple of things. I'm making the reflections, hearing Nicolette and Halima's reflections and report for the first time, so I haven't read the full report. So I'm going to give that caveat as I respond. There's first two kind of grounding things that I want to put into this room when it comes to the conversations that we're having. One was in the presentation we just saw, there was somebody that was quoted that was a bit feeling like the pressure of the systemic change that social movements need to put forward. And I have a slightly different perspective on that. And I have a deep belief based on historical precedent that with vision, with perseverance, and with commitment, that social movements, activists, our people are the only ones that can lead us out of the poly-crisis that we have. The second grounding point that I want to make is that in any conversation that we have around philanthropy, it can only be if we're truly being honest with each other that philanthropy is an extractive system, that is a system of a broken economic system. And so at best, as social movements in the continent, but also the work I've done across Asia and across Latin America and the Caribbean as well, is that at best we can engage it tactically as a redistribution method, but we can never look to philanthropy or any kind of external funding or resourcing to fund our liberation dreams. That's just not going to be the case. So if we have those two kind of basic functions, basic assumptions that I'm going to ask you to go with me on, the few things that I hold, both in the position that I currently have at the moment, but also when I'm consulting and doing just my own kind of activism work that's not paid, is a few things. I think as Africans and as African social movements, but people of the global South and, you know, in our South-South cooperation, we have to critically engage the role of the state. I think in the room so far, we've taken the state for granted, and I think at the very least, we need to negotiate our interactions with the state differently. And for me, I think we also need to decenter the state as the kind of central political terrain that we engage. It can be one of the terrains, one of the places that we enact and really build political life. But if we continue to structure what we want to see as our futures based on the nation state, which is coercive, which relies on a monopoly of violence, then we're going to continue to limit the ways that we understand freedom. And I think in this moment, we really need to start thinking beyond democracy and really start thinking about what will make our people free. And that's the question that I really am interested in and grappling with. And that for me means that my freedom dreams don't sit just within a nation state structure. The other thing that I think will be really important for us as well in this room as we're talking over the next few days is how we're expanding but also negotiating the ways that we interact with each other. So I think there's maybe 3 pots of conversations we need to have. There's the conversation within how are we engaging each other as civil society, as social movements. There's a lot of fractures, but all points of unity. Then as social movements, how are we engaging the state? But then how are we also engaging the broader public? And I think there's different tactics and strategies that we really need to sit with each other on to figure out how we move this forward. The other thing that I think is also important, 2 more points, and then I'll pass it to Becky, is that in part, due to NGOization and the ways that we've had to write our political struggles to be heard, but also I think in some ways a bit of a failure to look to history about what's worked and what hasn't, is that as social movements, we really need to stop delinking economic power from political and civil rights. Both of these things need to happen in the same moment. You are not ever going to have human rights if you don't have economic power, the ability for you to feed your own self and feed your own people. That's one. And then lastly, and this is picking up on the first panel where there was questions around kind of feminism, but also land and territorial struggles, is we no longer have the luxury to keep separating our struggles. We need to treat people and our communities as whole people. So people are workers, people are indigenous, people are facing a climate crisis, and people want economic and political freedom. So our struggles have to simultaneously be working on gender, on race, on class, on ending patriarchy, on understanding the ways that feminism is also a climate solution, but is also an economic solution. And so those things, I think, are the things I'm grappling with and the things I want to offer the room.
Thank you, Luam. We're going to go straight to Becky. We're adding some provocations into the room, right? So Becky, over to you. If you could please introduce yourself first.
I'm Peggy. I'm based at the West Business School. I run a center on philanthropy and social investment. So listening to the presentation, and I've had the benefit of following the different barazas that have taken place. I think one of the things that I thought about when listening to the context is that for me, while democracy is receding, especially in the global north, Africa is currently well positioned to offer lessons on democracy building, fighting unjust systems, and building solidarity, among others. And I think we've got great lessons from our liberation movements. We have great lessons from human rights defenders, from women's movements, among others. And I think this is the moment that Africa can really shine and show how it can be done. You have already seen how, with just as one initiative or one executive order, the global north is already struggling to fight the system. But we have centuries and centuries of lessons on this. So I actually think we have the best moment at the time to actually offer lessons to the global world. So for me, that's the first part. When I looked at the context that was presented, it looks gloomy, but actually it's an opportunity. In every crisis, there's an opportunity that we should take. The second, again, on the context, for me, listening to the patterns and the challenges that were presented, it really calls for a reimagination of our funding models. How civil society broadly is funded and social movements themselves, given the nature and the identity of the issues that they deal with. We heard that they really are defunded at the moment. But I think this is a time for a different model of funding. I mean, philanthropy is one of the models. It's not the only model. It's not transformative at all. But I think at this moment, we're really looking for transformative ways of funding. And I think one way of looking at it is looking at the wealth transformation. How do we use our own assets of wealth at the moment? Whether you're looking at land, you're looking at water, you're looking at oceans, you're looking at minerals, among others. Africa is well endowed, but it's how we utilize those resources to finance our movements that I think is required at the moment. I think the world of aid and the world of philanthropy is really just crumbled in our eyes. And so we need to be reimaginative in ways in which we can do this. So the shrinking and shifting space that I think Nicolette and Halima presented, in particular for social movements, while it is at its peak in in different countries, it has also created several spaces for me to look at collective actions, reimagined ways of mobilizing resources and transformative solidarity. And if we had given time, I would talk about what I see as the way forward, especially around resourcing social movements, which is to look into long-term models that would allow for the possibility to spend now, but still keep enough resources for longevity. And we've got already some examples from the Black Feminist Fund and many others that show us how it can be done. And so maybe thinking about creating some form of an endowment, a quasi-endowment, that would allow for social movements to actually do that. And Trust Africa actually did this kind of work a few years back, where we did a report looking into how a social movements fund can actually be created in the continent. And I think for me, looking at all that Halima and Nicolette presented, it comes down to how African social movements are going to be funded going forward. And I think looking at long-term funding models that take the form of endowments, a quasi-endowment for that matter, would actually do wonders for us. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for challenging us to think out of the box. It's been a long afternoon. And so I want to thank you all for sticking with this panel and the conversation. Thanks to Nicolette and Halima. Thanks to Luam and Bhekinkosi for adding additional information, additional thinking, additional layers to this. We're going to percolate on it, and we're going to come back in the next session for an open mic.